Chapter 20, Part 1. We shall overcome. Sometimes we fail to see what's in front of us. And sometimes we learn in school something that's a little bit different from what really happened, which I'll explain just in a few minutes. But in fact, the civil rights movement did not begin with Rosa Parks. Most people seem to think it has. It actually began more than a decade before it, and there had been sit-ins and boycotts and strikes and freedom rides as early as the mid-1940s. In other words, right after World War II. And I do like the way Dr. Franklin explains at the beginning of the chapter that there were overlapping movements and comparing it to a symphony composition. Now, the filing of lawsuits did not end with people began to be more actively involved in the protest. The suits would continue to well into the 1960s. Dr. Franklin calls it a movement of movements. In addition, it had begun to involve not only the black, but also white and the old and the young, and strangely enough, the federal government, and finally the press, without whom the movement may have failed. Now, in Virginia, in 1946, there had been a lawsuit, and the law over segregation on interstate bus travel had been ruled as illegal, but the ruling's not enforced. And the southern bus companies continue to operate on a segregated basis. And as you can see from the picture, you've got empty seats up front where the white folks are sitting, but there in the back, the black man has to stand because he can't sit with the white folks. Well, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, it kind of angered them, and they felt like a line had been drawn in the sand, and they're going to do something about it. So, according to Dr. Franklin, that decision not being enforced was the reason for them planning to make a 2-week, what they call, journey of reconciliation through not only Virginia, but North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. It's about the same time that the organization began to adopt the Mahatma Gandhi method of protest, nonviolence. And of course, that's Mahatma Gandhi on your right, speaking to his thousands of followers. And you combine the nonviolence with the Christian theory of love thy enemy and turn the other cheek, it's going to be quite successfully used in the future. Now, Thurgood Marshall is a really good man, and that's an older picture of him. I tried to find one when he was younger, but I couldn't. But when you watch the YouTube video of We Shall Overcome, but when you watch your video, you'll see a very young Thurgood Marshall in it, about 1957 or so. But he was against CORE's idea. He said, violating those local ordinances and riding the buses, it's going to cause more violence. But CORE decided to go ahead anyway. They held a 2-day meeting to rehearse what would happen and what could happen. But after all, the young people needed to know how to react when they were confronted by violence and with police and bullies. They needed to know how to defend themselves and just what to do. Because they weren't naive enough to think that nothing was going to happen or it was going to be a peaceful trip. Now, half of the group took a Greyhound bus and the other half took the Trailways bus. And the journey did not end well because most of them were unable to complete the journey because of either being kicked off the buses or arrested. And of course, the black newspapers carried the story in all their vivid detail, but the white newspapers barely mentioned it. Now, I'm not going to get into the bus boycott since you've read the book and you've got a book report to make on it, and I'm sure the text can't add anything new to your information. But I do hope you were pleasantly surprised at all those women who participated. In addition, that thing had been planned for some time, and they were just waiting for the right sort of person to be arrested. And of course, it mentioned in the book about the little girl whose reputation was a little bit sordid, and the old man. They weren't the right sort because they knew that they were going to cause some problems, and they needed to have somebody that fit the bill. And I hope you were surprised at some of the repercussions of the Brown decision. On the other hand, maybe you weren't. Hopefully, you've come to realize by now how badly some Americans were behaving and how racist they were, attacking the NAACP offices in some states, and some states even outlawing the group, saying that they were un-American. Schools, public libraries, movie theaters, stores, lunch counters, and buses all segregated in the South, and as briefly mentioned in your text, in many places up north. And of course, this is not a very good picture on the left of the school, but the black schools were so terribly overcrowded and undersupplied, but that's the way it was. They didn't have the money. And of course, you had the separate theaters, and as you can see, it's not a very nice theater. I mean, they don't have the money to keep it up. But I will remind you during this time that a very young Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is gaining prominence. And you can bet that when we have a test, there will be a question or two on here. And that being said, let's jump right into the order of business, the sit-ins. James M. Lawson Jr. He was a young man who believed in nonviolence. He attended Baldwin Wallace College in Barra in the late 1940s, and he got connected with others who shared his belief that racism is best defeated through nonviolent measures. He did graduate from there, and when he declared himself a conscientious objector and refused to report for the draft in 1951 during the Korean business, he served 14 months in prison. And he wouldn't take a student nor a ministerial deferment because he was going to the school to be a minister. But once he was released, he decided to do something else. So he was a Methodist, and he went as a Methodist missionary to India. And while he was there, he learned about Gandhi and his tactics of civil disobedience. He also heard how some of the organizations in the States were using the same nonviolent tactics. So when he returned, he went to graduate studies at Oberon College. And while he was there, he met Martin Luther King Jr., who had a speaking engagement in February of '57. And see, this is there again, right after the Montgomery bus boycott and the beginnings of his organization. And King managed to persuade Lawson to move to the South, and where he began teaching in workshops on nonviolence to black youth in Nashville. He also became the Southern Secretary for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And in 1960, King invited Lawson to become director of the Nonviolent Education for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that he just began. Now, Lawson played a role in nearly every civil rights movement that was going on down there, including sit-ins to desegregate the lunch counters and voter registration efforts. And during the Freedom Rides of 1961, he was one of the first riders that was arrested in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, some of the people that attended his seminars in Nashville on nonviolence and weekly sessions, they would become elders in the movement. And one of those mentioned in your text is a John Lewis. And this is not John L. Lewis, the boxer. He was a divinity student and later would become a U.S. congressman. And he had a terrible time understanding returning love with violence, even though he was in a ministerial program. But shortly after the Montgomery bus boycott, another group was formed in Atlanta in 1957 called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. And of course, Martin Luther King's going to lead that. Now, this is a picture of Woolworths on the left. This is where the sit-ins began. There's going to be a female fifth student, Diane Nash, that comes up with the idea of a lunch counter sit-in. And so they planned to have one. But just a couple of days before theirs was planned, 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, went to Woolworths and conducted the first sit-in. They weren't served, and they just sat there very quietly. And once they were arrested, some more came in. And the first day there was 4. Second day there was 20. The third day there was 100. And before you know it, hit almost 1,000 black people in that store. And of course, the protesters were arrested. And as soon as they'd be arrested, another group would come in and sit down. And these types of protests are taking place all over the South, in Florida, in Virginia, in Tennessee, in South Carolina, North Carolina. And when these people would be arrested, you know, the irony is they would be arrested for disorderly conduct when they're not doing anything. They're just sitting there quietly, not saying anything or doing anything. Or, of course, there's an old standby, you're disobeying a police officer. And unfortunately, on the way to jail, or even in jail, many were not only mistreated, but some of them were beaten. Another group was formed, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And they very quickly became influential and powerful in the movement, and they had an awful lot of white members. But they're going to eventually lock horns with the CORE and SCLC. But now, under the membership of SNCC, the SCLC, and the NAACP, they scheduled a demonstration in Albany, Georgia in 1961. And it's going to be there that they're going to have their first introduction or use of what they call freedom songs. Now, the leaders of this, the SNCC and the SCLC and the NAACP, they planned this demonstration, and they thought they had all contingencies covered. But they had overlooked the cunning of the local police chief, Laurie G. Pritchett, and that's him, the white man on the right. Crafty old bird, and I met him, and I didn't like him, because he had a plan. You see, in all the cities where demonstrations had taken place, it didn't take very long for the jails to go up to overflowing. Then what are you going to do? You have to turn them loose or crowd more and more into a single cell. But Pritchard came up with a plan, and he made arrangements with other towns in the area to let him use their jails. And so he'd bring them in the front door and out the back door and onto a bus and then transport them to another jail, and sometimes as much as 100 miles away. And more than 700 were arrested, and one of them was Martin Luther King Jr. And he gave his men orders, whatever you do, no violence in front of a camera. Of course, we didn't know what was going on behind doors. Closed doors you couldn't see. So you've got no violence for the papers to cover. You've got no jails overflowing. The officers are extremely polite. So why should the federal government get involved? And they didn't. Of course, Dr. Franklin offers his assumption on why this probably happened. Because James Gray, the Democratic Party chairman, which I also have met, was an avowed segregationist. He was also a close personal friend of the president. He also controlled the only television station and radio station, and there's where I disagree with him. He was also married to the daughter of the owner of the local paper. Now, it's all circumstantial, and it's looked at from a different point of view, but it does give you something to think about. And I lived in Albany, Georgia between 1960 and 61. I was there when this was going on. Like I said, I had met the chief, I had met the Democratic chairman. It's a Republican town. And when I decided to register Democratic, they were thrilled to death. I even got introduced to Mr. Gray. But, you know, in the South, back in these days, on Wednesday afternoon, the town shut down. It was hot in the summertime, so the businesses closed at noon if they even opened on Wednesday. And that's when a lot of the demonstrations took place. And it's another reason there wasn't that much problem, because there wasn't any white people downtown. And when I was there, my husband was stationed at the military base, and I was working. As a matter of fact, just a couple of doors down from where some of the demonstrations took place. And she'd call me about once a week and say, Miss Julie, I can't come to work today, so we got to demonstrate. So she wouldn't come to work. And she wasn't too concerned about the demonstrations either. So the Albany movement fails. But it wasn't all because of Pritchard and James Gray. They were only part of the problem. You see, our groups are not getting along. They're fighting over control and who's going to be in charge. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is very angry with the Southern Christian Leaders Conference for trying to take control. And of course, it's led by Martin Luther King, and being a Christian organization, they think they should have control. And the SNCC also felt that those few minutes King was spending in front of the cameras was detracting from the movement. They were more focused on the man instead of what was going on. But even failures can teach you something. And from the failure of the Albany movement came two very important lessons. Freedom songs are very important because they're inspirational, and they make you feel good and give you a reason to go on. And the power of the press. And as much as they didn't like King getting all that coverage, the press, the white press, could and did reach people who otherwise would not have known what was going on. So these lessons are going to be quite useful and successful when they come to Birmingham as a target. And this is where I'm stopping. This is where we'll begin on our next lesson, primarily because that YouTube I'm going to have you watch is quite lengthy, and so you don't need a lengthy lecture on top of the YouTube. But do watch it all the way through, because it's not a movie. It's real people, real news items. Do watch it. Thank you for listening.